We often think of our Stone Age ancestors, maybe just picking berries, scavenging a bit. Survival seemed like, well, like walking a tightrope.
Right, a constant struggle.
But what if that picture's incomplete? What if sophisticated group hunting, real planning, showed up much, much earlier than we usually think?
That's exactly the shift in thinking that's happening. It's pretty exciting.
It's one of those moments where you go, hang on a minute, these people weren't just scraping by.
And that leads us right into this deep dive. We're focusing on a specific place, the archaeological site of Schöningen in Germany.
Schöningen, okay.
Yeah, because it's yielding some really compelling evidence for these surprisingly complex hunting strategies way back. We're leaning heavily on a recent study by Hudson and colleagues in the Journal of Human Evolution.
Excellent. So think of this as like a shortcut to understanding a really key piece of early human social behavior. It challenges those old, maybe simpler views.
Definitely. Gives us a much richer picture of what our ancestors were capable of.
And if you're listening because you want to get a solid grasp on these kinds of complex topics quickly, this is perfect.
And the detail from Schöningen is just incredible. The analysis covers a huge amount of material, tons of animal bones, especially horse remains,
Horses, okay.
ecological data, the actual hunting weapons, wooden spears, these double-pointed throwing sticks.
Wow, preserved wood.
Exactly. And butchery tools, too, stone flakes, even tools made from bone.
But there's a catch, right? No actual hominin fossils.
That's the slightly puzzling part. No Homo fossils found right there at the main site, Schöningen 13E-I-4. So who were these hunters? Well, it's still a bit open. Could be ancestors of Neanderthals, maybe common ancestors of Neanderthals and us Homo sapiens, or perhaps Homo heidelbergensis.
Right, the usual suspects for that time period.
Pretty much.
Okay, so let's frame our mission here. We want to really dig into the Schöningen evidence, specifically this idea of specialized communal horse hunting.
And explore what that implies, for how these Middle Paleolithic hominins lived day to day, managed resources, how their groups might have been organized.
Let's start with the site itself, Schöningen. Where in Germany are we talking?
It's in Lower Saxony, and it was actually discovered during lignite mining, brown coal mining, east of the town of Schöningen.
Ah, so an accidental discovery in a way.
Pretty much standard for many of these finds. This mining exposed this amazing sequence, up to 45 meters deep, of really well-preserved lake sediments from the Middle and Upper
It was
Pleistocene.
lake sediment, so it was a lakeside environment.
Yes, exactly. These layers show the lake levels changed over time. And the specific site we're focused on, Schöningen 13I4, comes from a particular warm period within that sequence.
The Reinsdorf Interglacial.
That's the one. It's dated to marine isotope stage 9A, which puts it around 300,000 years ago.
300,000 years. Yeah.
And the really crucial finds, the spears, the bones, they come from a specific layer within that period known as the spear horizon.
The spear horizon sounds dramatic.
It is quite evocative. It's a layer maybe 30 to 40 centimeters thick. And back then, this paleo lake was pretty big, maybe a square kilometer, and fairly deep in parts, up to 7.5 meters.
So the mining basically peeled back the layers on this ancient lakeside scene.
Precisely. An incredibly well-preserved snapshot, essential for understanding how these hunts might have actually happened.
And the excavation itself, how big an area are we talking about?
At 13II-4, they excavated about 3,900 square meters. It's substantial. And what's really interesting is that most of the finds, the spears, the bones, the tools, are concentrated in a fairly narrow band, maybe 10 meters wide, running north-south.
Along the old shoreline?
That's the thinking. It represents the main high water mark of the lake when the spear horizon was forming, like things accumulated right at the water's edge.
Frozen in time, almost.
Almost. You can imagine the land sloping down from the west towards the deeper lake in the east. They even see dark staining on many bones in that zone, probably from contact with decaying marsh plants right near the shore before burial.
Any signs of campfires, habitation?
Interestingly, no. Despite some earlier suggestions, the latest analyses haven't found any definitive evidence for controlled fire. No hearths, no clearly burned bones confirmed.
Huh. So maybe not a long-term camp, but a processing site?
Or a recurring hunting and butchery location. That seems more likely.
Okay, let's get to the core evidence. The focused horse hunting. You said horse bones dominate.
Absolutely dominate. Hudson and colleagues looked at nearly 15,000 bone fragments in their study. Identified horse bones, Equus mospachensis, made up something like 61% of the identified total.
61%.
And if you include fragments that were just identifiable as horse-sized, that potentially pushes the horse total up towards maybe 92% of everything.
Wow. Compared to what else?
Well, the next most common animal is red deer, but that's only around 2% of the identified remains. Then you have small numbers of European ass, giant deer, roe deer, bison, aurochs, even elephant and rhino species show up, but in very low numbers.
It's not just a slight preference for horses, it's
Uh-huh.
laser focused.
Exactly. That's the key takeaway here. This wasn't random opportunistic hunting. It strongly suggests a deliberate, focused strategy targeting one primary prey species.
Which already hints at, planning and knowledge of the environment.
Definitely.
How many individual horses are we talking about?
Based on counting specific teeth, the minimum number of individual, or MNI, is at least 54 horses.
54. That's a lot of horse.
It is. And they found evidence for both males and females within that count.
So what does this focus tell us? Were horses just incredibly common there, or were the hominins actively choosing them?
It's likely a bit of both, but the consistency points towards active choice. They were clearly selecting horses over other available large animals like bison or aurochs, which were present but don't show signs of being hunted by the hominins here.
Okay, so a deliberate strategy. Does the study look into which horses they were targeting? Like young ones, old ones?
Yes, they look closely at the age profiles using tooth wear analysis. It's quite revealing.
What did they find?
Well, at first glance, looking at broad age categories, juvenile, prime adult, old adult, the pattern didn't look strongly selective. Kind of a mix.
Yeah.
But when they did a more detailed analysis, looking at specific age ranges based on tooth crown height, a different picture emerged. They found a really high percentage of young horses, particularly those under 2 years old.
Lots of young ones.
Yeah. Then there's a relative lack of horses between 2 and 5 years old. But then the frequency picks up again in the 5 to 6 year range, prime adults, before gradually declining among the older animals.
So hitting the very young, maybe avoiding the trickier young adults, and then getting prime adults too.
That seems to be the pattern. It's more complex than just random hunting. It suggests they might have been strategically targeting the more vulnerable youngsters, but also capable of taking down healthy adults in their prime.
And does this tell us anything about when they were hunting? Seasonality?
It does. Looking specifically at those young horses, the ones under 2 years old, their deaths seem to be spread pretty evenly across all seasons.
All year round.
It seems like it. Which suggests consistent year-round hunting pressure on the horse population near the lake. There's a little dip in finds dated to May-June.
What might cause that?
Potentially linked to the foaling season. Maybe the herds dispersed more, or mothers with very young foals were harder to approach or target effectively. But overall, the pattern points to sustained hunting activity throughout the year.
Which brings us back to the idea of group hunting. It's hard to imagine one person bringing down 54 horses, even over time.
Absolutely not. The sheer number of horses, the evidence suggesting multiple hunting and butchery episodes clustered here, it all strongly supports the hypothesis of communal hunts.
How would that have worked, do you think?
Well, you can imagine groups tracking horse herds, maybe using the landscape, driving them towards ambush points along the lake shore. The lake itself acts as a natural barrier.
Trapping them against the water.
Exactly. And it's plausible, even likely, that different members of the group had roles. Maybe some driving, some ambushing, potentially involving men, women, maybe even older children, much like we see in ethnographic accounts of communal hunts among more recent hunter-gatherers.
So we're really shifting from that image of a lone hunter or small band scavenging to organized cooperative groups.
It's a significant shift. It underscores that idea that these hominins were much more capable socially and technically than we sometimes give them credit for.
It paints a much more complex social picture. Okay, so they've successfully hunted these horses. What happens next? What does the evidence tell us about how they process the carcasses? The butchery marks must be key here.
They are. And the bone assemblage itself is remarkable for a site this old. For the horses, it's generally quite complete skeletally.
Meaning most body parts are there?
Yeah, but with some interesting patterns. There's an overrepresentation of elements from the head, neck, and the upper front limbs, and an underrepresentation of the lower hind limbs and feet.
Why might that be? Transport. Preservation.
Preservation plays a role. Denser bones survive better. But bone density alone doesn't fully explain the horse pattern. For the few red deer and bison aurochs remains, their representation does seem more strongly linked to density, which limits what we can say about transport decisions for them.
But for the horses, where it's not just density, the patterns must mean something about butchery or transport. What do the cut marks show?
They show a lot. There are numerous cut marks indicating meat removal filleting, especially on the long bones and the mandibles, the jaws.
Taking off the big muscles.
Right. There are also marks showing dismemberment at the joints, separating limbs, and clear evidence for skinning.
Skinning, how can they tell?
They find specific types of transverse cuts on the lower limb bones, near the ankles and wrists, and on the front of the lower jaw. These locations are typical for hide removal. They estimate at least 15% of the individual horses show these skinning marks.
So hides were definitely a target resource, too.
Seems very likely. And there are also marks suggesting evisceration, removing the internal organs, based on cuts found on the inner surfaces of ribs.
What about other marks? Scraping.
Yes, scraping marks are also present on horse bones, often found together with cut marks and impact marks.
What were they scraping for?
It could be related to cleaning the bone surface, maybe removing the periosteum, that membrane covering the bone before breaking it for marrow, or potentially even using the bone surface to resharpen stone tools.
And marrow extraction. You mentioned impact marks.
Yes, clear impact notches and fractures on the long bones and mandibles, indicating they were deliberately breaking them open to get at the rich marrow inside.
Was everything smashed to bits then?
Not entirely. While many marrow-bearing bones were broken, the overall degree of fragmentation isn't extreme, which is interesting in itself.
And didn't you mention bone tools earlier, made from these same animals?
That's right. Around 200 bone tools have been found, things like retouchers and hammers, likely used for making and maintaining stone tools. And they're made from horse, red deer, and bison or ox bones, often apparently selected right from the butchered remains at the site. Resourceful.
Very. It sounds like incredibly thorough processing. Meat, marrow, hides, bones for tools. But you hinted before at something seeming maybe less than optimal, like wasteful butchery.
Yeah, it's this intriguing paradox. On the one hand, you have evidence for intensive processing on many individuals. On the other hand, they also found relatively untouched remains.
Like what?
Complete vertebral columns, ribs, shoulder blades, even pelves, often with very few cut marks. And quite a few long bones left unbroken, marrow still inside.
That is odd. If marrow and meat were so important, why leave them?
Exactly. It's led researchers to consider alternative priorities. What else might they have been focusing on that wouldn't leave such obvious marks on the main skeleton?
Such as?
Fat. Fat could have been a primary target. Subcutaneous fat, fat around the organs, neck fat, back fat. It's incredibly energy rich.
And removing fat might not leave many cut marks on the bone itself.
Potentially fewer, depending on how it's done. Organ meats are another possibility, highly nutritious, quickly consumed, leaving little trace. And hides, as we discussed, were clearly important.
Could the timing link to hides? You mentioned the peak in young horse deaths.
Yes, the peak in juvenile deaths in late summerly autumn might correlate with when horse hides are in their prime condition, thickest after the summer. So perhaps hide quality was a factor in their seasonal hunting patterns.
So maybe their definition of optimal use wasn't just about maximizing meat and marrow from every single carcass. They had other priorities.
That seems plausible. Maybe fat and hides were sometimes the main goal, especially if meat was already plentiful from previous hunts.
Okay, putting all this together, who was responsible for this accumulation? Hominins or carnivores?
The evidence points overwhelmingly to hominins as the primary accumulators. Butchery marks far outnumber carnivore damage, like gnaw marks.
And when both are present,
The butchery marks are consistently underneath the carnivore damage. And the hominins got there first, did their processing, and then carnivores, likely wolves, might have scavenged the leftovers.
interesting. Any difference in how they treated younger versus older horses?
Yes, the study noted that subadult horses seem to have been less intensively butchered for meat and marrow compared to prime adults. And their bones were also less frequently selected for making bone tools.
Maybe smaller packages, less return for the effort?
Could be. Or perhaps different parts were targeted.
And were they hauling big chunks of these carcasses away or processing them right there?
The fact that most skeletal parts, even the less useful lower limbs, were found at the site suggests that major carcass transport wasn't happening. They were likely processing the animals there and transporting the valuable resources, meat, fat, hides away from the bone pile.
And the year-round evidence suggests they weren't just passing through.
Exactly. The seasonal spread of juvenile deaths points towards a sustained, possibly year-round hominin presence utilizing this specific lakeshore environment.
For how long did this go on? Is the Spear Horizon one big event or accumulated over time?
While the Spear Horizon itself probably represents a relatively short geological moment, the archaeological record within it likely built up over multiple hunting and butchery episodes, possibly spanning several successive hominin generations.
generations using the same spot.
It seems so. The consistency in the types of finds, the technology, supports this idea, along with evidence for rapid burial, which helped preserve everything so well.
And the fact that scavengers didn't just demolish everything suggests the hominins had a real presence there.
Yes, it implies a kind of territorial dominance. They could apparently leave substantial portions of carcasses behind without them being completely destroyed by competing carnivores, suggesting they controlled access to this resource-rich area quite effectively.
How does Schoningen compare to other sites from this period? Are there parallels?
There are. You can see some similarities with sites like Boxgrove in the UK, which is even older, showing early evidence of large mammal butchery. And there's evidence for communal hunting tactics at other Eurasian sites too, like Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, and various Neanderthal sites known for large-scale hunts of bison, aurochs, rhinos, horses, reindeer.
So Schoningen fits into a broader pattern, but maybe offers exceptional detail.
Exactly. The preservation and the sheer volume of interconnected evidence, the weapons, the prey, the butchery patterns, the environmental context, made Schoningen 13I4 a really key reference point, a model for understanding Middle Pleistocene hominin hunting, subsistence, environmental knowledge, and resource management.
It definitely pushes back against simplifying these sites as just kill sites or habitation sites.
Right, those labels probably don't capture the full complexity. Schoningen was likely a focal point in their landscape, used repeatedly for specific complex activities related to acquiring and processing vital resources.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this. As we wrap up this deep dive on Schoningen, what's the single most important thing listeners should take away?
I think the big picture is that Schoningen provides really strong proof of a remarkable level of planning, social cooperation, and deep environmental understanding among these Middle Paleolithic hominins, specifically focused on hunting horses.
It just fundamentally shifts our view of their capabilities, doesn't it? Beyond simple survival.
Absolutely. It challenges those older, perhaps more primitive images. The key insight is recognizing this capacity for sophisticated, coordinated behavior much earlier than often assumed. That's the real aha moment.
It really is. And it leaves you with some fascinating questions to ponder, doesn't it? If they were such skilled, organized hunters, but maybe sometimes left usable resources behind, what does that tell us about their priorities?
Their social dynamics, maybe even belief systems or rituals connected to the hunt.
Yeah. What drove those decisions to leave potentially valuable meat or marrow? Was it just about fat and hides sometimes? Or something else entirely?
Yeah.
It's really intriguing.
It certainly invites more questions than it answers, in some ways. If listeners want to explore this further, I definitely recommend looking up the Hudson et al. Study in the Journal of Human Evolution, or seeking out other research on Middle Paleolithic lifeways.
It definitely reframes how we think about human evolution and the deep roots of complex social behavior.
Schoningen truly gives us this unique, detailed window into the lives and abilities of our very distant ancestors, a glimpse across 300,000 years.
An incredible glimpse. Thanks for unpacking all that detail with us.